Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this AJA and Jersey Architecture Commission talk. It's lovely to see so many of you here and a range of professions, so thank you and welcome to all. We've been hoping to set up talks with Jersey Architecture Commissioners for a number of years, and I'd like to thank you and acknowledge the support from the Association of Jersey Architects who've allowed us to be here this evening and to hear from Lindsey. Lindsey is one of our Jersey Architecture Commissioners, and she has a specialism in landscape. And her talk is self-explanatory, but perhaps most importantly from a landscape perspective. I think a conversation I just had said there are a number of these talks, but they come from a natural environment perspective. So Lindsey is a member of the Landscape Institute. She's a fellow of the Landscape Institute and a fellow of the National Geographic Society. So she is well versed in being able to help us understand this subject. She will talk for about 20 minutes, and then I think the most important thing for us is to get a question and a discussion going, because this is something that's new to Jersey in some respects, and it will be helpful to understand what we can learn from other places and how we might implement it. So without further ado, thank you, Lindsey.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for coming. There's quite a lot of people here tonight. I think you're going to have to bear with me a little bit. I'm very new to the island. I arrived about 6 hours ago, but I've been driven all around it today. I'm quite baffled by everything. I'm very intrigued actually by what I've seen. So it's very diverse, it's very interesting, and it looks really delightful in the sunshine. So thanks for organising that for me. Thank you for being here. So as you've explained, this is going to be a talk from a landscape perspective. That's what I am. So it's going to be a little bit different, I think, for some of the architects, but I'm happy to take questions at the end. So I'm going to talk about the opportunities of BNG, that's Biodiversity Net Gain, and targeting process, essentially, that are now part of the UK's planning system. And as I see it from a landscape perspective, that might not be the way that everybody else sees it, but the way that I'm seeing it as it's being rolled out. And forgive me, please, if I make any mistakes regarding your planning system and the UK planning system. I'm only used to the UK planning system, so if I get that wrong, please bear with me. So a little bit on myself, just so you know who I am and why I'm here. I am a landscape architect. I specialise as a landscape and green infrastructure consultant. I've got long-term experience of giving landscape-led advice to planners, design teams and developers, and that's on all kind of scales and types of schemes, from strategic green grid networks, really big scale county level, urban master plan work, to pocket parks and really tiny detail work. In terms of my day job, I'm a freelance consultant. I work for myself. And this is a kind of sample of the things that I get up to on a day-to-day basis, generally offering landscape design advice in all sorts of different areas, across lots of different review panels. I sit on quite a few, actually. I'm based in the Midlands. I'm not based in London, actually. I'm from Yorkshire in the first place, so I'm very keen that I've got to bring more of a northern perspective to things. But I sit on a number of advisory groups, the National Trust, to work with Homes England, and just lately I've been working with MHCLG, the Ministry for Housing, Communities and Local Government, on setting some design requirements for the National Model Design Code. But I think that all that work, really, I'd like to think, gives me good insight into quite a lot of different planning and design process issues. So I'm often sitting in the role of critical friend or specialist advisor, and I think that's what I'm going to be doing when I'm sitting on the commission. So giving critical advice, but in a friendly way. So if you come forwards, hopefully it'll be more towards the friendly kind of side of things. But a lot of these schemes that I see, I'm really lucky to see snapshots of quite varied development schemes, from site assessment, where we first get involved, through to strategy level, master planning, all the way through, lots of different sites and shapes of schemes all over England. But particularly at the moment, I'm doing quite a lot of work on design coding, which I'm increasingly involved in, which is very difficult, actually. But that's a different talk. Maybe we'll come back for another talk another time. I find myself here because, as Tracy's pointed out, I'm recently appointed as an interim advisor on the Jersey Architecture Commission, hopefully bringing my experience from design review to Jersey. So, in my role as a landscape consultant, it's all about giving design advice on how to embed natural assets and green spaces into sustainable schemes to deliver design quality that doesn't compromise natural and social value. So it's really about balancing natural value, social value, and fundamentally that's giving us landscape-led design. That's what I would consider to be landscape-led design. So often in design review, I'm often looking for schemes that properly take into account natural value as the starting point, so not a leftover that's dealt with at the end. I'm always encouraging the integration of ecology and biodiversity into the design process. And I'm always advocating for landscape-led design as an essential component of sustainable schemes. That's for people and for nature. So it's all about social value integrating with natural character. And it appears to me that you've got quite a lot of natural character on the island that you want to integrate with. Okay, if we turn to Jersey, as I said, I haven't been here very long, and I've only just scratched the surface of its complexity and diversity in character. And you only have to look at this map, which is what I did before I came here, to understand that there's an awful lot going on. And that's really evident on the trip that I've had today, actually, a huge amount of diverse character in a quite small space, actually. But I'm already aware that on the island, natural environment is a really important and valuable asset for lots of different reasons. And it's one that deserves protection and enhancement. And that's very much where BNG can come into play. Now, as I'm sure you're all aware, much better than I am, the Bridging Island Plan doesn't have a specific directive on BNG yet. Maybe it should. But it does have policy that sets the expectation for protection and improvement of biodiversity on the island through the development and planning process. But as yet, it doesn't actually set targets for BNG. And I think what might be useful here is I can talk through the system that I've been involved with in the UK that set a system for biodiversity net gain. So what I'm hoping is useful is if I introduce the BNG targeting system that's been set up, and it's already integrated into our planning system in the UK for the last year or so. If I set that up and then we can look through it and what's been good, what's been not so good about it, and then we can have a discussion about how you feel about maybe that process on the island. So firstly, a brief update on where we're at with BNG. So that's biodiversity net gain. Simply put, BNG is the requirement to uplift biodiversity units by a 10% minimum through habitat restoration, creation, or enhancement on site, or through offsetting. And that's mandatory from February 24. So for the last year, that's already been in place, that all developments need to put forward a proposal for how they're going to meet the BNG uplift. So, I mean, fundamentally, the intent is to leave biodiversity in a better state than it was before development took place. That's the fundamental starting point for the process. But specifically, that means integrating more and or better quality habitats provided as part of development schemes. And that's guaranteed, so that's mandated. The point of all of this is that at its highest level, it addresses the climate crisis and more specifically the ecosystem crisis. The aim is to halt or reverse biodiversity loss and encourage nature recovery. It's also about integrating ecology and environmental value into the planning system at a local level from the start of the process, rather than leaving it to something that can be added on at a later stage in development. So what it means in the UK is that there are now clear and measurable expectations on delivering ecological contributions that need to be met as part of the planning process. They're not negotiable, they have to happen. They're part of the planning process, the planning application process. What it means is that there is a level playing field in terms of expectations for biodiversity. There's no arguments about it, it's mandated, and that's what's expected. So developers need to come forward with their proposals for how they're going to meet BNG uplift. From my point of view, sitting on design review panels, it means that what's happening more and more often is that conversations are happening about biodiversity as a matter of course, and they're happening earlier in the process, and they're happening just as part of the normal course of applications. And I would like to say, actually, in my experience, that mostly in a positive way, and people are talking at levels higher than the mandatory minimum. So we're often hearing schemes who are looking to contribute towards 25%. Actually, these are bigger schemes. For the bigger housing schemes that we're looking at, much bigger than the schemes that you might encounter on Jersey. But we're hearing developers talking about developing green frameworks that really contribute biodiversity at quite high levels, actually. And this is really important. It's a really positive part of the conversations that we're now having. So just a little bit about the process itself, because I'm not sure how much everybody understands about the process. I'm not an ecologist, so I'm not coming from an ecology perspective. I'm going to talk about the fundamentals of the process and how it might work. So just a couple of the key points, really. The starting point really is the BNG metric that's used. So that measures the biodiversity value of habitats on site before the development takes place, and how many habitat units are needed to replace any units that are going to be lost and achieve a 10% gain. So that's what we're talking about. We're talking about what's there on site in the first place. We're actually going to uplift that, so we're getting more by the end of the development scheme. Ideally, we'd be looking at the BNG metric tool applied at site selection stage, which is a really interesting point here. So the reasoning being that if a scheme couldn't easily demonstrate the potential for 10% uplift, it should raise concerns as to whether it's potentially the wrong development on the wrong site. So if you have a valuable site to start with, maybe that isn't the best place to put your development. So the site selection stage is a really important point to consider BNG and how it might be achieved. And that's really what's being recognised and measured with the BNG requirements. We're looking for appropriate development on appropriate sites, which then be designed to good quality, so you get a good biodiverse environment at the end of it. Secondly, talking about the provisions, so within the provisions are included options for offsetting your biodiversity contributions, either off-site into other rare habitat situations or providing in alternative solutions agreed with the local authority. But I think it's really important to note that those offsetting contributions shouldn't be seen as an automatic default solution, but rather a last resort. So it's down to the development team to justify why they're not providing on-site solutions. So if you're offsetting, it's sort of missing the point really of what you're trying to achieve through the BNG process. The idea being that local level interventions to protect, replace and enhance habitats alongside development is what BNG is looking to provide. So by looking for an immediate offset solution, you're actually not encouraging that local habitat enhancement. What we're really looking for is BNG uplift within a well-designed landscape framework that sits on the site and responds to local networks, for natural networks really. So we're looking for well-designed frameworks that can be managed for long-term gains, both for wildlife, but also for local communities. So we're encouraging connection with local wildlife and encouraging that kind of interaction between the natural world and people. And that's what we're talking about when we're really talking about sustainable development. It's development that really works for people in the right place. So by and large, in my experience, this does seem to be happening with sustainably designed developments in the UK, but with responsible developers, actually. I will caution that there are issues coming to light for small sites. And in the UK, they're defined as sites that are less than 100 units. And I think the difficulties there are the constraints that are put on sites accommodating infrastructure development overall. And actually, BNG is seen as another difficult constraint to accommodate within a small site. But I think that's currently under review actually by the government. They're looking at a slightly different system to cover small sites. I wouldn't like to promise that, but I know that they're certainly looking at monitoring how that's going to play out. What I will say is that I've been working with MHCLG on setting new design requirements for it's a National Model Design Code update. And all the developers that came to the table at that workshop, I was surprised by this, but they saw BNG as a positive element in design and planning, actually, where you might expect them to be really against it. They were all really for it. I think not least of it because it's an outcome-based requirement, so it's up to them how they provide it. It's within their control, and they can be quite site-specific and bespoke about the way that they meet the uplift requirements. But also, not least of which, it helped them sell houses. I think that was where they were really coming from. They're being asked for green solutions and being able to talk about the biodiversity improvements that they're able to offer helps them sell houses, and it also helps them meet their own sustainability aspirations for their schemes, so they're also keeping shareholders happy in that regard. And I think once you begin to understand where they're coming from, as long as they've got a clear directive on what they need to provide, and that level, that requirement is the same level for everybody, they're actually quite happy to accommodate that and see the benefits of it, which I think is a really positive message from the way that this is playing out. It's only been in the system for a year or so, and already developers are really picking up and working with it. Not all developers, but definitely some of them are really appreciating what's trying to be done by the BNG uplift. Okay, so we're just moving on slightly on from BNG to talk about what I would consider to be landscape-led design. So for me, the BNG target is really just another way of talking about a landscape-led approach. And they're completely complementary in the design process. So this is really simple to set out. The site is the starting point for design. The first step is to assess and understand what existing natural assets that you've already got on site, and that involves ecological assessment. The next step is to back that up by landscape context assessment, that I'm sure you're all familiar with. But by setting these site-specific BNG targets that are all about protecting the valuable habitats that are already there, and then by looking to minimise negative impacts and create more and better habitats, you're really leaning into a process that's based on creating a really strong landscape. So when those BNG habitat objectives are recognised right from the outset, it becomes quite easy to accommodate nature-positive solutions into a landscape strategy. At the start of the design process, you already know which habitats to protect and which to enhance and where they are on site. So it's really about building a landscape framework about that existing setup on site. So landscape-led design works with the natural assets that are already there on site rather than against them. It doesn't try to remove them and give yourself a clean slate. It's actually working with what's already there, and it incorporates them into a well-designed framework. And that's what we're looking for when we're talking about landscape-led design. So a landscape framework would naturally integrate any BNG interventions into a multifunctional network. So not just about biodiversity, but a network that includes provisions for open space, recreation, play, and social interaction. And they don't all have to be separate requirements. They can actually all be accommodated within one landscape green framework that also includes provisions for nature. So what you're beginning to build there is a framework that provides for people, communities, and nature all alongside one another in one place. So what you're looking at here through landscape-led design is offering real opportunities to incorporate and add environmental value as part of a well-designed place. So I'm sure we're all here today because we're responsible designers and planners, and we want to consider the environment, the natural environment. We want to protect it. We're all promoters and supporters of well-designed places that are driven by sustainability objectives and aspirations. And really the starting point for that is respecting the natural environment that you've got, and it's all around you here in Jersey. You can't fail to, it's all around you, you can't fail to see it. I'm an especially keen advocate for landscape-led solutions to placemaking. And that really does mean design that's led by the site itself as a starting point. So the key to this is integrating a landscape-led approach into the design and planning process from the outset. It's not about leaving landscape issues to be dealt with as an afterthought. I think that's one of the key red flags for schemes, is when we see landscape treatments being thought of afterwards or squeezed into leftover spaces rather than being the framework that sets the tone for everything else. So it's the real framework that sets placemaking. But this is where BNG targeting fits into that process, actually. It's what it's all about. It sets standards for the outcomes of design that ensure that the existing natural environment is the driver for design solutions. So it doesn't follow on afterwards. It's the driver for how design is set out and how places are created. So it encourages placemaking, which strikes a good and positive balance between spaces catering for people and nature, and spaces that cater for both people and nature together, all in one space. So I'm coming to the end now. So I just wanted to sum up really and say that if you can look at the opportunities that the BNG targeting process offers in a positive light, there are problems, but if you can look at the positives that it offers in a positive light, it leads you towards placemaking where existing natural assets are protected, restored and enhanced alongside new biodiverse habitats that are becoming rarer, The right things are in the right place on your site, guided by the site and led by the landscape context. And you'll end up with design development which respects the natural environment. It rebalances priorities in favour of nature positive solutions. And nature positive solutions give benefits for both people and place. And that's what we all want, really, isn't it? We want to be creating good placemaking spaces for people to enjoy. Thank you. So I think we're going to open the floor up for questions. I'm happy to take questions on BNG, landscape-led design, or even design review. I'm less happy to take questions on Jersey because I don't know very much about Jersey yet.
Thanks, Lindsay. I'm not sure this is working or not, but you mentioned about the UK basing the design for the net gain on the scale of the sites, over 100 units. Here in Jersey, that's more of a rarity.
Yeah.
And in the past, it's been talked about, actually, if it's not down to the quantity necessarily of the net gain, it's then down to the quality you're improving. Can you give us some insight into how you'd approach it for those smaller sites, please?
Yeah, well, I think, so that at the moment, the same system is applied for all sites in the UK. So no matter what their size, the requirement is that you provide a BNG uplift of 10%. That's the current situation, but they are looking at smaller sites, and they're calling smaller sites less than 100 units. So they're looking at that because that's proved so difficult. It seems to be a burden on what you're needing to provide within everything else. And because you're looking at a small site in the first place, you just don't have the space to accommodate. So I think, what I will say is the benefits of the proposal to just have a 10% uplift, and it's really that simple as a requirement, is that it is down to the design team and the development team to justify how they're going to provide it. So I think rather than setting a fixed rule or a fixed condition of you must provide this here, where, that kind of level of working, it's left to the design team to meet the requirement. And I think that's what's important about the metric, is that the design of how you meet the B&G uplift is within control of the development team. Now, that said, I think for small sites, they're much more quickly looking at off-site or offsetting options to meet the requirement. And that's not necessarily a problem. I think a lot of that would depend on a small site and its context, and whether actually the requirements for rare habitats or habitat enhancement proposals close by. And I think that's maybe a way forward for small sites. It's maybe a way forward for small sites so that the cumulative gain of a number of small sites contribute to a bigger habitat enhancement scheme elsewhere, but still close. I think the main thing to remember about this, though, that it's trying to provide local interventions that are related to the development. So I think if you lose that completely from sight, then actually it's sort of counterproductive, because the contributions of natural environment to community building are lost. So I think it's difficult when you're on smaller sites. We all know how difficult it is to design things on tight spaces. But I think the best thing to take forward is you should look at what's there, you look to retain what's there, and then look at a way to meet uplifts that might probably more likely to involve offsetting solutions for your smaller sites. Yeah, I know I've realised that there's not many big sites on Jersey, and I'm used to really big sites. I chair the Hemel Garden Communities panel, which is a huge development, and for them, interestingly enough, they've got different issues at large size. They can meet BNG requirements actually quite easily, but their BNG requirements are clashing with a different type of requirement that they're supposed to provide for SANGs, which is suitable access to nature and green space, which is really difficult. But actually, because that's for recreation, it's kind of clashing with their requirements to provide for BNG. So even big sites have problems. But I think the point of this is that the design is within control of the design team. You just need to meet the uplift. Sorry, that was quite a long-winded answer, but.
Hi. One of the questions I wanted to ask was around the challenges of setting B&G up in the first place. And I think you mentioned that Natural England had done a lot of work to set up B&G in the UK. And I just wanted to know whether there's been much sort of challenge around defining what the metrics are, and any challenges or any difficulties faced in assessing what's on the site at the moment, what the value of it is relative to the value that you need to put in place?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm not an ecologist, but what I do know, and I think actually a simple system at the end of this belies an awful lot of hard work that's gone into working out the metric, what's achievable, what's responsible, and how it can play out within the planning system, actually. So this idea for a very simple metric of a 10% uplift, I think there's an awful lot of hard work that's gone into making sure that that's aspirational, but still realistic. So I think in terms of working out the metric, they've developed a system for measuring habitat units, which is meant to look at, I mean, I'm not an expert on this, but it's meant to look at on-site how you can establish this kind of unit that you can then enhance. So the problems with this have been that they need ecologists really to look at sites and work out this habitat baseline situation. And they're becoming rarer, and they're also doing lots of other work. So I think the problems there in terms of resourcing how you would start your initial site assessment work, and also how they're identifying. I mean, the Natural England done a lot of work in identifying offsetting sites that you can contribute towards. So they already have that backdrop in place. They've done quite a lot of work in terms of which habitats schemes can contribute towards. But yes, it's becoming increasingly difficult to get ecologists to actually do the work. Now, that said, I think there are different ways of measuring metrics, and developers are looking for different ways to work that out so that that part of the process doesn't slow them up. But I think, yeah, I mean, ideally, we'd have lots of people trained in working out how to start the metric system off. But it's not complicated. It's not a difficult system if you're an ecologist.
Hi, I'm just interested in your thoughts on tight urban sites. There isn't an awful lot of opportunity sometimes, but green walls were seen as a big solution. But in recent times, I hear that if they're not maintained, they die off and become fire risks. Is the BNG calculation kind of responding to that or not?
I don't know that it is responding specifically, but I do think it's really interesting that you've asked a question about urban sites, because I think they can be especially difficult, because they can be, especially if they're sort of what people might term brownfield sites, because they're where people want to put development because it seems like a good idea, but sometimes they actually hold some of the rarest habitats that really do need protecting and enhancing. So I think there's really difficult decisions for the planning setup to work out in those situations. And I also think you raised the really interesting point there about that actually this system is only as good as it is looked after and how it's seen into the future. So BNG comes with a 30-year requirement to look after the uplift that you've created. And I think there's lots of different models coming forward in terms of how housing schemes particularly are looking at management and maintenance models. It's less about local authorities adopting schemes and looking after them. It's more about private management models, which bring their own problems because fundamentally the costs fall back to residents. So I think there's issues about how they're looked after as well. And I think they're only just beginning to play out, actually, because we're only a year into this. I think you asked a specific question about green walls. Yeah, now, I'm not an enormous fan of green walls unless they're done really, really, really well. And I think that's rare. So I think in that situation, the value is in how well they're designed, what their role they're trying to play in a scheme in the first place, what they're really trying to do. Are they really trying to make an ecological contribution or not? And also how well they're designed to make them work. They're quite rare that they work really well and work as well as they should in the longer term, I think. Was that all the parts of the question? Yeah. Yes.
I think Mike kind of picked up on this, but on a tight constrained site or even on a large site where constraints might prohibit suitable or sufficient BNG being provided, is it ever acceptable for remote sites to deliver BNG contribution and presumably have to be tied into the overall planning delivery of a site? And secondly, I think, again, you've already started talking about it, but you mentioned that the actual management and long-term delivery of BNG has to be secured over a 30-year period in the UK. Locally, I may be wrong, there'll be experts in the room who know this better than I do, but I think locally planning conditions usually tie management, landscape management and ecological management for a 10-year period. Is that a problem, and should that be uplifted to a 30-year requirement?
Right, okay. Yes, it is acceptable to use off-site solutions to meet your BNG gain, but the first starting point is that you should be looking to provide on-site or providing the justification for why you can't provide on-site. So I think it's always understood that you might not be able to accommodate even on large sites, but that's part of the discussion that you'd be having as part of the planning process. But ideally, you would be providing on-site, particularly for larger schemes. There are sites that Natural England will guide you towards where you can contribute. And there are also, I think there are beginning to be schemes where at local level you can contribute to BNG sites, so to speak. In terms of, I'm not clear. I think I'm learning how housing works on Jersey. And I don't think it necessarily follows the models that we have with some of our larger developers or some of the really big developments that we're talking about in garden cities and things, whereby you'd actually have a management model and a stewardship model that's part of the planning application. You'd want to know how those open spaces are going to be looked after in the long term. And then that's normally paid for by resident contributions as part of the scheme. It's what you buy into when you buy into one of these sites that's got quite strong green infrastructure provision. So that's not something that's having a 30-year management and maintenance tie-in isn't something that's strange for the UK necessarily. I think the point of BNG is that it's really trying to look forwards as to how do we really make a difference in terms of shifting the line, in terms of nature that we're protecting and biodiversity enhancement. So actually they're trying to look further ahead deliberately. That's the point of it. Whether you should change, I mean, I think we should all be looking further ahead, shouldn't we, for that? We want this to work in the long term. We want to be more nature positive generally. So extending the timescale that you're looking at is not a bad idea.
Hi, Lindsey. I was just going to ask whether you had faced any sort of political challenges, and if so, how you had dealt with them.
Right. Not especially myself, no. I think this leads on to a different topic, actually, if I talk about at the moment, there's a lot of pressure to deliver a lot of homes in the UK. So 1 million, that's quite a lot. And there are two issues with that, is how do we actually deliver, how do we get those houses delivered? And second to that is how do we maintain the quality of the housing and the places that we're creating? And those are two of the biggest problems that we're looking at the moment. We're talking a lot about design coding at the moment, and I think it's not a politically, I'm not involved politically, it's not a political issue, but actually in terms of coding, there's different pressures on how you set the fixes and the requirements for what has to be delivered as part of the housing process and where you allow flexibility for response. And this is quite interesting in relation to BNG targets, I think, because if you're too strict, it actually just applies another layer of constraints onto the process. Whereas being too flexible means that developers won't meet what you need them to meet to create good, sustainable green places. So I think the BNG target is an interesting way through that in that it's setting an outcome. So it's asking for an outcome. But what I will say is when we were talking to MHCLG, they were much keener on setting strict requirements, setting something that's a real clear condition that needs to be met, rather than an outcome-based approach. So I'm not sure that helps you, but I think it's the world that we're in at the moment, is what do we fix and what do we keep flexible? And you've got to keep returning to what your intent for the whole process is that we're trying to not destroy what we've got, keep it, retain it, and make it a building block for part of your design process, and actually then look forward to how we can protect it in the longer term. So, yeah.
My question is relating to the type of biodiversity. So is there like frameworks in the UK where in specific areas a certain type of biodiversity is encouraged rather than just a developer saying, I'm going to do this type of biodiversity? So it's a bit more of a, let's say, a localized framework of this biodiversity is identified as important in this particular area?
Sort of yes and no. So it's site-based. So I think the starting point, if you're coming at this from a development point of view, is your site and what's important on your site. So, but that said, Natural England have a system where they'll point you towards contributions towards habitats that are really important in particular areas. So I think it's a combination approach, really. So, yeah, does that sort of...
Well, I was going to say, is it, if somebody comes with a different kind of biodiversity approach, would that be seen as a negative, as opposed to because they're not following a framework or board in the area?
So I think what's what seems to be coming forward as I'm seeing it, and I'm not a planning officer, so I'm not seeing a huge range of schemes here. I'm seeing a sort of particular snapshot of certain schemes. But what I think is becoming important is actually conversations about biodiversity happening. So developer teams are coming forward and going, this is what we've found, this is what we think is important, this is how we're combining with our approach to SUDS or our approach to something else, or recreation and our green infrastructure framework. And this is the networks that we're plugging into, and this is how we're connecting into natural environments. It's those kind of conversations are happening more now. So I don't think there's a, if you don't do it this way, it's more about justification and explaining your process that includes biodiversity as a driver.
Hello. I was just going to
now
ask...
the landscape architects are starting now.
I was just going to ask, may I ask your thoughts on building with nature in England, and whether you, because it's something that can run in tandem with BNG on a site and offers solutions to...
I'm not used to this system, so
Right.
I don't come into contact with that myself. That's probably just the way. Do you want to explain?
Well, it's another way of incorporating green infrastructure and habitat improvements on site through a different process, and it may be more because sites are smaller on Jersey and there are more constraints, and I think with smaller sites, off-site offsetting mitigation is going to be the answer. It's another way of ensuring you deliver green infrastructure. But I was also just going to say, in BNG terms, Cornwall Council have had that in their local plan for a very long time, because when I was working in England, I used to part own an ecology practice, or a landscape practice, and we were obviously based in Devon and doing a lot of work in Cornwall. So they've got a lot more experience at delivering BNG. It's over probably 8 years plus, something like that. So
well, I think this is. I don't think this is a new
No.
system at all. I think landscape architects have been doing this for ages. I
Yeah.
think we call it different things. I think we've called it green infrastructure framework.
Yeah.
I think at
Yeah.
a lower level, certainly, and this is why I'm talking about landscape frameworks, because I think any size site can support a landscape framework, which means that you have a strategy for how you're dealing with your existing vegetation and how you're going to incorporate that into your scheme. So I think we've been doing it for a long time in different ways, but I think this is a specific intent that really manages to embed increasing more and better quality habitats into the system. And I think that helps.
yeah, and I'm pleased you spoke about valuing what exists already, and I think that's the key.
Yeah.
How we approach assessments and how we value existing infrastructure is really important.
And what I will say, I think valuing the natural environment doesn't always fall to surveys either. So I don't think it's always about ARB surveys and tree condition. I think sometimes it's about a tree that has particular community value or amenity value. Yeah, yeah.
There's a few comments I wanted to add on to. Trish and I run a Cornish-based landscape architecture practice, so we had a little while. So the first one was about and I think you'll probably agree, Lindsey, the UK system has errors in it.
Yes.
And I think so Jersey's in a really good place to be able to create something that may not be flawless, but it can go a long way to actually ironing it out to make it better from an ecological point of view, but actually also from a development point of view. Lindsey touched on the character. There was a map that came up of Jersey. So your comment about the right type of biodiversity, right type of BNG, it should be design-led. So responding to character and place and sort of microclimates and micro ecosystems and working with that.
And this is the talk I would have given if we had an hour, I think.
Yeah. So hopefully this helps. The other one, this tight spaces, is landscape-led is number one, but also there are architectural solutions to BNG. So bee bricks, bat boxes, bird boxes, that kind of thing can also help with your BNG score. So I won't go on.
No, I think you're quite right. I mean, we're talking about BNG fitting within a framework that we already talk about. And one of the really important factors here is your context for your site. So what's on your site already and how you connect into what's already there in terms of natural environment, but also community.
Just one quick question, if I may. A lot of what you've talked about is BNG delivered through new development.
Yeah.
And should BNG come to Jersey, I'm very interested in St Helier and how that could be improved. And what it doesn't seem to cover is how government infrastructure can be improved through BNG. We've got a lot of streets in St Helier that have never seen a tree in 200 years. And I think it would be And we seem to encounter unbelievable problems in getting trees in the ground in St Helier. That's why most of the marine planters are not necessarily always doing so well. So I'm just curious to know if there's a strand of BNG in the UK that puts local authorities on notice that they also have to pull the weight too.
Okay, so I think my talk tonight is just trying to head up principles of BNG and how it's going positively, really. I think it's all for discussion in terms of how that can play out. I think there are lots of other conversations happening in and around BNG that are, not least of which BNG sits within Natural England, and other bodies in the UK are dealing with other issues. So actually, as part of the National Model Design Code, they're talking about setting requirements for street trees as part of new developments. So, and that, of course, involves quite a lot of complicated working out with other agencies, highways agencies, you know, all of that kind of, the normal stuff that we have to deal with on design sites, but actually making street trees as an important part of placemaking in new developments is coming to the fore. And I think it's all related to dealing with environmental issues better within new design. In terms of how you might, well, I think this is all about actually, this is a conversation I was having the other day. It's about rebalancing how we see infrastructure and the qualities of infrastructure. So actually a lot of this is about bringing green infrastructure so that it's a priority for building nature positive places, and actually maybe readjusting how we see grey infrastructure and the dominance that has over developments and the way that we deal with that. So actually it's a lot about shifting towards active modes of travel and understanding that they can, if we downplay the role of vehicles, then actually we can play up some of those more attractive qualities of places, green streets, places to cycle, places to interact, so social spaces as part of a green infrastructure network, all of that kind of thing. So actually I think this is about talking about rebalancing priorities across the board, probably. A lot of conversations are happening at the moment about how you integrate green into streets and how you so you're not over providing for connectivity. You're not providing for a pavement and a cycleway and a tree and a large road. You know, it's actually about really trying to play down the dominance of grey infrastructure. But what I will say is when I talk about green infrastructure, I also do mean blue infrastructure. So that's a component that we also need to put into the mix. This is about making sure that infrastructure works better altogether, I think. Does that help? Yeah.
Very, very last one I was really getting at is it's focused a lot on new development. There's an awful lot of existing streets and infrastructure that are treeless and greenless, and I was wondering how that could change.
Okay. Yeah, I don't think that's... it's interesting, I've been talking this afternoon about certain protections that we have maybe on trees, particularly older, more mature trees in the UK, and how we sort of... we take them for granted, I suppose, maybe, and they don't happen in the same way here. I don't think there's the same pressure, actually, in terms of encouraging BNG in different environments. But I do think that this is how the conversation is going to start, maybe. Yeah.
Back to ecology, and I've got a question about the fundamental definition of biodiversity.
Right.
So Tracy's given you a tour around the island, a whistle-stop one. You'll have seen the wonderful cultural diversity and biodiversity that the island has to offer. But what you've really seen, I'd suggest, is a selection of monocultures. If you've been driven around the north coast and down St. Juan's Bay, and through the wooded valleys, you've seen woodlands, you've seen a heath landscape around St. Juan's Pond, a monoculture of reeds. Now, I've seen an ecological report into, for instance, what was described in very negative terms by an ecologist as the monoculture of reeds around St. Juan's Pond. I'm quite concerned that biodiversity is a bigger, better enhancement and really could potentially harm some of the ecology that we have in this small island of Jersey.
You're concerned that you'd lose some of the important habitats that you already have?
Yes, I'm concerned that we would break up some of the habitats that we have if we follow this ruling that you must have a quantitative 10% gain.
Well, I'm not going to speak to Jersey and specific habitats, and I'm not an ecologist, but I'm not sure that's the intent of what we're talking about here. And this is just the UK system, so I guess it's really down to Jersey to implement a system that suits their own natural environment. But I'm not sure that it would, I think it's meant to enhance, retain, protect and enhance rather than cause losses. Yeah.
Yes, I'm sure that's I'm sure that's not the intent. However, the way it is phrased, it does seem to me to be always looking to go one step further, and very often what we have here in Jersey, in particular in our many varied environments, they're there for a reason, and they don't need enhancement, is what I'd say.
If you put a development site in it, it might.
Hi. I've heard stories and rumours from colleagues in the UK of developers potentially gaming the system. So with existing baseline, so basically site clearing before that baseline is established. How do you police that, and how do you deal with that sort of like the more unscrupulous end of the impact of BNG?
Yeah, I mean, but we've always had that, I think. You know, we've always had a system where developers will, you know, remove newts from a site or do, you know what I mean? But that's not responsible development. And I think, I mean, the developers I'm talking to aren't like that, and they do see it as a positive thing. And I am trying to talk about the positives of the system, actually. You're quite right, there are various problems with the system, and I think it's going to take quite a long time before this all shakes out, really, to a system that everybody's comfortable with. But I think it's really important to, I mean, I don't know how you police that, because, you know, how do you police environmental matters across the board? There's always going to be people that are really trying to just develop. But I think what this does is this sets a system whereby the site is the starting point. So it doesn't favour a process that tries to start with a clean slate site. I think that's probably the way to police the system. Is that's if you're approaching with a site that's a clean slate site, it's clear there's a problem in your starting point. Yeah.
Sorry. Is there a system? You know, are there established consequences if you're discovered to have done that as a result of BNG? You know, is within the policy, is there, you know...
Well, we have, I mean, TPOs and tree protection orders, and that's something that I think, this is where I'm struggling because I don't quite know what you've got here and what you don't have here. TPOs, so you'd have, I mean, that falls under criminal law, so you'd actually have high level fines, £20,000, £30,000, fines for deliberate taking down protected trees, but that's only as good as having the tree protected in the first place, I suppose. So yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Lindsey. Because I'm not a landscape architect, I'm a transport planner.
Okay.
So I have one question, because since last 3-4 years I've understood the term BREEAM. BREEAM and this BNG is a new term for me, because I used to work in Saudi Arabia. They have a different term, Mustadam, which is quite similar with the BREEAM. So does this BREEAM and BNG is the same thing, or it's a different, you know, matrix is different?
A different system. So BNG is coming from a more of a ecological starting point. BREEAM is looking for kind of trying to provide system, I mean, you might correct me here, actually, you might be better at BREEAM than I am, but marking a system for where you get good environmental design included in schemes. So I think both of them are trying to encourage ecological input to the system, but BNG is specifically coming from a habitat, natural environment perspective.
My question is, it's a bit broader, really. So coming from a landscape perspective, I was really interested about the point about kind of the social value and the community aspects. And I think what we see with a lot of design, certainly around St Helier, is actually they're very nice things to look at, but actually people can't enjoy them. Children are not encouraged. You know, we have parks for children to play in with play equipment, and we don't have kind of natural spaces for children to play, for adults to socialise, for older people to sit and kind of be part of a community. And I wanted to know how this could impact that, really.
Yeah, okay, I think this might be where, I mean, I'm used to a system, because I was asking today, wasn't it, about what requirements are for green space provision and essentially green infrastructure framework planning. And I've seen a lot of what you might call more formal parks, and I haven't seen much more informal green space. So green space that might be for nature, but it also might be for social interaction at a lower level. So it might include things like play on the way. A lot of my conversations at the moment are all about play on the way, those kind of things. So I think that's maybe a difference between what I would expect to see provided as part of a development and maybe what's not necessarily asked for here in Jersey. So I agree. I would be looking for a whole range, a spectrum of provision between active and passive recreation for social interaction, and that can happen on really small sites. It can just be a really small space, but that's well placed and actually is really specifically for integrating a community, so they've got an outdoor space to socialise in. Or it could be for nature, or it could be for accessible nature, and I think there's a whole spectrum of provision. And I would call that a green infrastructure framework. So it's a multifunctional network. It doesn't all have to be separated. It'll all be one thing. But I mean, that's what I would look for in a scheme of any size. Maybe smaller scale site, you'd call it landscape framework. Larger scale site, you'd call it a green infrastructure network. And you'd be looking for it to connect into a broader network as well. But yeah, I would expect to see that as part of any new development that you're providing for. And this is something that we're talking about a lot more lately, social value. Natural value, social value, how can you make all of that happen? That's what makes a good place. Yeah. That's another talk.
Right, that's super. So we've got 2 other talks lined up. Thank you, Lindsey, that's super. Thank you very much for your questions. The reason that we're using this fluffy mic is not so you can hear me through speakers, but so that the cameras can hear what's being said. So forgive me shoving it in various faces as we've gone. That has been absolutely fascinating and gives us a lot of food for thought across the industry. And I'd very much like to thank Lindsey for her contribution to the discussion. Thank you very much.